right. Well, welcome everyone here to our third and final online virtual discussion related to the Lehman trilogy at Timeline Theater. You probably were expecting someone else here as the moderator this evening. Nick Bowling, our co-director, unfortunately became ill today and unfortunately wasn't able to be here, but he invited me and I was very excited to jump on in his stead and become the moderator tonight for this very exciting conversation. My name is Lara Goetsch, and I am a Timeline company member, and I'm also the director of marketing and communications for the company. I've worked with Nick for many years, have been involved in this production all along. So very, very excited to welcome you all and our two distinguished panelists who are also production team members of the show, and I'm happy to introduce them now. First, we have American University professor Pamela Nadell, whose book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the National Jewish Book Award's Jewish Book of the Year. She is currently writing Anti-Semitism in American Tradition, under contract with W.W. Norton, and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Award. She's thrilled that her first experience working on a play is here with all of us at Timeline Theater, and I'm very excited to welcome Pamela.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And our second panelist this evening is Carol Ann Tan, also known as Kat, who's a Singapore-born director and dramaturg whose work focuses on a question of how we might survive the absurdity of a post-pandemic society. I would like to hear more about that. She received her MFA in directing from Brown University, and recently she has directed Wolf Play by Hansel Jung, 2 Mile Hollow by Leah Nanako-Winkler, and the USA premiere of Tango by Joel Tan. She is an associate artist with Silk Road Rising and currently serves on the faculty of the National Theater Institute at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. Welcome, Kat.
Thanks, Lara.
Hello, hello.
I'm also excited to be here.
This is great. So we have a very exciting conversation and several topics to cover tonight, but I also want to make sure to invite everyone who's here to know that you can enter questions for our panel into the Q&A function in this webinar that should be located at the bottom of your screen. You can see Q&A and you can type in your questions, and as we get further along in the conversation, I'll take a look at those and be sure to pass them through to our panelists and make them part of the conversation. So I hope you'll throw in any questions that you might have along the way. But to get us started with our panelists here from our dramaturgy team, I guess I wanted to ask each of you first, what drew you to working on this play, the Lehman trilogy? And I'll let either of you just sort of jump in and start.
Maybe I'll start this one, and Kat will start the next one. So the first thing that I want to tell everybody is I've never worked on a play before, not even in high school. But a colleague of mine at Northwestern had bumped into Nick, our director, Nick Bowling, and our co-director, and he was looking for somebody who knew Jewish studies, who would be able to explain the tremendous Judaica content that is in this play. And she was really kind and recommended me. And I don't know if she remembered, but when Nick interviewed me for the position, I told him that I was a major theater geek, that I go to the theater as much as I possibly can. And I had actually seen the Lehman trilogy on Broadway, not when it was at the Park Armory before COVID hit, but I had seen the Broadway production, the one that won like 5 Tony Awards. And I was like so excited to be invited.
Wonderful.
Great. Unlike Pamela, I've worked on a lot of theater productions. Nick invited me to work on the show when I was wrapping up my MFA at Brown. And I was interested, well, the first reason I was interested was more on the producer side. I had a relationship with Timeline before I went to Brown. And knowing the directing team of Nick and Vanessa Stalling, I had a deep respect for the work that they did, and I was really wanting to be in a room with them. I had not envisioned it being together. I thought that, because co-directing is a very specific thing, but that really excited me. And I did not know the play when Nick sent me this invitation. And he said that the reason he wanted me to work on the play was for immigrant's perspective of what the American dream was. So I read the script and I found it a rather stylistically challenging play, and I think I was curious to see where the directors are going to take it. So for that theatricality of form, I was really interested in working on this, and I had not really known the famous Broadway production before this, unlike Pamela.
Well, I think that gets us into a little bit about the history of this play and sort of how it came to be, how it came to Chicago, or just, who wrote it, when, and why. Kat, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so at the time I didn't know this, but then obviously I had to do a lot of research on this play once I accepted the job. So this play started off as a radio play, actually. It was originally written in Italian by Stefano Massini, but and the radio play was many hours long. I don't remember the exact number, but it was way longer than the version that's currently playing now at the Broadway Playhouse. And that was successful. And then its first premiere as a stage play was actually in French. It was performed in French in France. And then after that, I think it came onto it had a couple like small European productions. There was also finally an Italian language production. And then that from the success of that production, Stefano Massini turned the play into a book. He wrote a novel about it, and then it started getting on the radar of Ben Power, who translated and adapted the play. And even in the book form, even in that other form, it was very, very different. The European production did not only have 3 actors; it had a more open company. And the book itself, the audiobook version, I believe, is something like 11 hours long. So there was a lot of cutting down that needed to happen, and then for Ben Power's adaptation went to the UK and it premiered at the West End through the National Theatre in London. That was extremely successful, and that was the 3.5-hour version that we are now going to be performing. And from the success of that production, it transferred to Broadway. And actually, the original Broadway production was supposed to open in March of 2020, a very special time. So after about 4 preview performances, that got cancelled. Wow. And then they finally came back and opened for real in 2021. And from the success of that, the rights for Lehman Trilogy became available to regional American theaters. So the production that Timeline is doing is not the National Theatre version that went to West End and Broadway, but it is a Chicago homegrown version. And now Lehman Trilogy is playing at many regional theaters across the nation, and that is true of all the regional productions. They are specific with the specific director's vision and specific production teams that every city is producing, but they are specific to the cities that are now being produced in.
That's great. Thank you. That was an excellent history and such a incredible pathway that this play has had. And Timeline feels very lucky to be doing this homegrown production here in Chicago and to be able to share it with everyone here. And, as you've both gone through the process of working on this play, can you talk about anything that surprised you? Anything about the play, about the process? Something that sort of stuck out to you as and when you first got into it, or as you went through the process and thought, oh, this is not what I thought, or opened up some new ideas for you.
Maybe I'll start. So the first thing that surprised me was I didn't realize that the play had been written as Kat just gave this amazing history, had been written in earlier versions, and that the novel came afterwards. So I actually read, even though I'd already seen the play, I decided to read the novel first. And the novel is actually, it's 700 pages of blank verse, which is not so bad, because blank verse is usually about 2/3 of a line rather than a full line. But I did read through that to get a sense. And then for me, and we certainly can talk more about this, but for what really jumped out at me is that this is a play. It is an invention. It is fiction. It is fiction. The way I kind of look at it is there's a structure, almost like a hanger, because we kept thinking so much about clothing and material at the beginning of the play. But the coat that they craft, or the garment that Massini crafts, is largely fictional, and he just, he invents all sorts of things. So for me, what was really surprising was having to suspend my judgment as a historian, because after all, we're dealing with a script, and the script is, it's like the or text. You can't change it. That's what you've got in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, similar to Pamela, because I have a bit more of a history working with timeline theater, I was very used to the very historically specific dramaturgy that timeline demands of the dramaturgs that it hires. And I came into this project prepared to look at what looked like what was going to be 150 years of really exciting historical research, which I also did have to do because that is the ask of working at timeline theater. But to Pamela's point, I realized that there was something a little like another edge above the dramaturgy of this play, that we did have, it was important to understand some of the historical context that created the institution of the Lehman Brothers that we see it today. At the same time, the play has made all of these changes in the name of poetic license, in the name of creating a particular theatrical world in order to achieve a different point. And the usual timeline approach, just a little insight into, rehearsal, usually at timeline table work, it is a very historically driven kind of nerdy process where we are constantly fact-checking the play and discussing how it intersects with known history. And I was starting to realize in the rehearsal process that this is not really the way into this particular play, that the dramaturgy of the play was asking for something very different from the historical reality as we know it. And it created that challenge for me of how do I hold the mission of timeline theater and also what this play is dramaturgically demanding of its directors in the way that I contribute to this process.
Well, I just want to add that we were constantly fact checking and then discovering that it was not accurate.
Yes.
We were, I went to the first table reading. I didn't bring my laptop. I didn't know I was supposed to do that. And then by the next one, I spent the whole time on the laptop saying, this isn't right. That isn't right.
So that's so interesting. The idea that this play mixes fact and fiction. And I think many audience members don't necessarily know that. And, kind of curious to have, and may not understand why that's the case, why Masini may have done that. What are your thoughts about why that is the case with this particular play? And what are sort of, I don't know if there's dangers to that, do you see, of an audience sort of experiencing something like that?
Well, we seem to be passing it back and forth, so I guess I'll start this time.
Yeah.
So for me, I think, and this is purely my interpretation, it's not necessarily a factual reading or what I hope you as the audience is taking away from this play, it's just what I see. But what I see these changes doing is that it positions the Lehman family as at the center of this financial world that the playwright is trying to talk about. It attributes to them many achievements of the era. It puts them as the front pioneers. It makes them, in a way, the linchpin of how the financial world developed over 150 years. And I feel like it personalizes the story in a particular way. It asks us to see what it is for a single family to interact with the American dream in this specific way, what it is for the single family to interact with the financial world as we know it in a specific way. By personalizing it, it kind of asks us to think about how we view the financial world as we know it, and how we view the role of individual in greater structures and institutions.
Oh, that's so great. So for me, what really jumped out is how ahistorical a lot of the Jewish material is. So these are German immigrants. They come in the 1840s. They would not have done a lot of the actions, the religious actions that are shown in the play, because I think first of all, Masini is not a historian. So I think he was viewing their sense of Jewish identity through what we tend to know as the East European Jewish experience, and not as these modernizing Jews whose name was originally, a version of Lowe, and they changed it to Lehman. And they would, Henry in the second scene, he would never have walked into a shop and put his hand up and kissed the mezuzah. He just wouldn't have done that. That's something that a pious East European Jew would have done. So for me, a lot of it was this pushback against all of the things that I know are ahistorical in the play.
There's a question from the audience about maybe giving a couple of examples of what in the play is not historically accurate. So I wonder if either of you might, I think you just mentioned one there, Pamela, and if there are any others that either of you might want to call forward that maybe would be good examples for the audience to recognize.
Well, I mentioned one, so we'll give it to Kat.
Yeah, so the play attributes, for example, the construction of the Panama Canal, I believe, is said to be spearheaded by Philip Lehman. In reality, that was more of a government initiative, a US government initiative. So, again, the conflation of something really like big and structural to a single family.
And one of the things that jumps out at me is when Bobby marries, and I forget her name, but what they never tell you is that it actually in the play, it says they come out and they're on 55th Street in New York. So you're supposed to think that they're probably getting married at Temple Emmanuel, which is where they're supposed to be members. First of all, Temple Emmanuel is not on 55th Street. Secondly, he married a Christian. They got married in a church. They didn't get married in New York. So they're they, for the sake of the story, they don't want to go into that. So it's his poetic license, his license as an author.
And Kat, I feel like there were ways that you in the program book, if those of you who attended the play or will attend the play, and we have our backstory program, and Kat and the whole team put together a really great timeline, which sort of tries to call out some of the ways that the poetic license is used in the play and how it differs from the historical record. If you're looking for that, it does exist on our website, and can be looked at as a PDF. So that's an interesting place to see some other examples. Pamela, I wonder if we could, there's a couple questions here related to practicing of Judaism and the play's characters, and also where they ended up in terms of, coming to America. So I think you alluded to this, but, a lot of times folks think of Jewish immigration as taking place around the pogroms in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century. But these three brothers came much earlier and came from Bavaria. And can you talk about those Jewish folks and the story of them coming here? And then a little bit about how they ended up in Alabama, because that's, a question people ask about, how did that happen, and maybe why they would have chosen to go there.
Right. So I think most people are familiar to some degree with the very large East European Jewish migration that, exactly as you just said, Lara, that starts in 1881 in the wake of the pogroms, and by 1924 has brought over 2 million Jews to America from Eastern Europe and changes the nature of the American Jewish community. But Jews have been in America since 1654, and they were a really tiny community. And then beginning in the 1820s, they start to come largely from the various German-speaking states. So not just Bavaria, but the Germany is not unified at this point. So they're coming from different German-speaking states in Central Europe, and that's how they come. And the reason they come from Bavaria, and the reason Henry comes over, Chaim originally comes over, is because of all of this restrictive legislation that's put on German Jews in the various states that they came from. So just for one example, they paid exorbitant taxes. They couldn't, once the children grew up in the family, many towns had a limit on the number of Jews that could be there. So it's possible that Henry would have had to leave the town that he lived in once he reached a certain age, as his brothers would have, because the town wouldn't allow any more Jews. And the other thing is that they also even limited the number of marriages that could take place, so that by the time a young man would be eligible to marry, because a marriage in the town had, somebody had died, he could have been, well along in his years. It could have been, often they talk about them being gray-haired by the time they're able to marry. So they come to America. It's not an easy journey, as we know. There's one of those scenes where, one of the characters says that, he's on firm ground for the first time, and they come to America, and the historians who've written about them think that Henry ended up going to Alabama because some of the people that he traveled on board ship with went down to Alabama. What we do know is that this was a migration initially of young single men who would bring over other brothers, just the way the Lehmans did, to help them get along in business. And they all started out as peddlers. And then they would eventually accumulate enough capital that they could open a small store. And that is the story of Henry Lehman.
Mm-hmm. And is there evidence that they may have encountered anti-Semitism in that area, or is that something that?
That's a really good question. I mean, historians talk about the notion of prejudice against Jews in America. At this point in the South, to be honest, he was seen probably as white. He's a shopkeeper. He's building up a store in the town, and that he doesn't seem to have encountered specifically anti-Semitism. I didn't find it in the sources that I read. We certainly know that there's anti-Semitism in America at this point in time. It's mostly Christian anti-Semitism. The Jews are different, but also by the 1840s, there is a synagogue in Montgomery, and not Henry, but one of his brothers is an officer in the synagogue, so they're a member of that community.
Mm-hmm. Kat, you alluded a little bit to the American dream and sort of coming on board the production to talk about talking about the immigrant perspective. And this is kind of jives, there's a question from Morgan in our audience, jives with something that I was going to ask a little bit as well. So you mentioned that one reason you were brought onto the team was for immigration perspective. In a position where a dramaturg would usually be more fact-based, how do you balance giving your personal perspective on a scene versus a fact-driven one? That's a very interesting question and connected to other things I want to ask.
Right. Yeah. I do. This is something that I think I teach my students as well. I teach the dramaturgy course at NTI. I think there's a common perception that the dramaturg is the research machine of the production. The reality is that I think the role is a little more nuanced than that. Yes, we do a lot of research for the production. We do fact check the historical veracity of things that are happening. But the reality is that everybody who works on a production team is performing that function as well. I have never gone to a production meeting where I thought the designers hadn't done their research and I had to do it for them. The actors usually also come into rehearsal and they are prepared. So it's more of a resource to add on to the work that they're already doing. The other section of dramaturgy that I think is what actually draws me to this field a little more than just being good at Googling. It's this idea, I think, that the dramaturg is a third party in the room who is responsible for helping to bridge the words of the playwright with the vision of the director in order to create a coherent experience for the audience. So the way I see my role in rehearsal is to think very deeply about what the directors are in pursuit of, and in terms of the audience experience they're trying to curate, trying to think about what the playwright themselves is saying in the words that they have written, and trying to make sure that the choices in the room cohere with all of these sometimes conflicting intentions. So when I come into it, to the other part of the question of my personal feelings about a scene, I think as a dramaturg, it's first and foremost, I am there to support the artistic intentions that are happening in a room. So sometimes when I have personal feelings about a scene, it needs to be justified by the text. First and foremost, it always comes back to what is written. And when I was giving notes to the directors for this particular play, the fact that the playwright has made so many deviations from historical truth told me that what the playwright is in pursuit of in the text that he has written is not actually like historical veracity. It is not about a replica of what happened in history. So when I think about that, and I think about what Nick and Vanessa have been saying in all the production meetings that I attended about what they were interested in doing, I think about what an audience is coming in here, maybe like looking for the kind of experience they want to get out of sitting in a dark theater for 3 hours. That's a big ask. And and when I wrote notes to Nick and Vanessa, I was holding these things and I am looking at the work that is happening in the rehearsal room, and I am noting them quite simply on what is effective and what is not effective, especially as a third party person who isn't mired in the minutiae of like, okay, now the actor walks here on this line, are the lines even correct? Like, I have a little more distance from the production than the directors do. So, and that is how I see my role in the room. And I think this coheres a bit with some of the more contemporary functions of dramaturgy as well, like new play dramaturgy. There is so much more to dramaturgy than just research, but research is the core of what we do.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kat. Pamela, I'm interested, you mentioned that you've never been involved in a production before, and I think sort of this is an interesting time to ask you sort of what it was that you learned being involved for the first time behind the scenes and getting a chance to see a production developed from script to stage, and any observations you have about that process and your part in it.
Well, the first thing is just listening to Kat, because I learned so much from Kat. She was sort of like I would ask her questions about like, what do we do? Why do we only have a 5-minute break here? What's going on? And it was, I mean, Kat was amazing. And I want our audience to know that Kat graduated the University of Chicago with my daughter. And so it was very exciting for me to be working with somebody who's my daughter's age. It was really, really, Kat, thank you. I learned so much, but of course I learned so much also by watching Nick and Vanessa, our amazing co-directors, and our extraordinary cast. So for me, one of the things that I discovered, because I'd never been to a table read, and I spent 3 days with everybody doing the table read, is that it was like an advanced graduate seminar with the smartest graduate students I have ever been in a room with, because they would read a scene and then we would talk about the scene and look at different lines. But what is, like Kat was saying, what is Massini trying to get out of the scene? What do we see in the scene? What is authentic? Because there is the sense of, what's authentic to the script as opposed to what ideas we might have. So that was extraordinary for me. And then also for me, as somebody who's always been in the audience, but to see how the pieces came together. So I not only was there for table reading, but I actually came back for the first preview so that I could give notes on the first preview. And then I'd actually, when I my husband and I periodically would get invited to opening nights because they needed to fill the theaters. This was in a period in the 1970s when the New York theater was really in bad shape. And so we actually would go to occasionally to opening nights, but we never got invited to the party. And I was so excited to be invited to the party. And to sit with Kat.
Parties are much of the fun of theater. We get to opening night. Excellent. So we've had a couple questions here about the practicing of Judaism in the play and the characters. So maybe we'll, from Barbara, we have this question. Please comment about the issue of practicing Judaism and the play's characters. Over time, they seem to assimilate, become American, and reduce the time spent on certain practices. Has this been true for many Jewish immigrant groups?
So absolutely. I mean, this is actually one of the places where I think the author really got it right. And I think that's why he has them doing so much tradition and ritual in the first act, is because he wants to show one of the ways in which they assimilate and show also how Judaism changes over time. And of course, some of the things that he says when he writes it. So for example, in the second act, when Herbert is saying, it's Herbert who says, I have a problem with this, right? It's Herbert, I've got the right one. When Herbert is supposed to be in Hebrew school in the second act, and he's supposed to be getting ready for his bar mitzvah. So this is one of those places where you have all these errors. So the first thing that happens is by the 1880s, when that's supposed to be taking place, the synagogue they're supposed to go to in New York City, the big Temple Emmanuel, they don't have bar mitzvah any longer. They did away with it. Second thing that happens is he never would have been saying things about, I have a problem with the fact that women don't get to light Hanukkah candles and only the men do. I mean, that's just, those are essentially anachronistic readings about things that would happen as Judaism would change over time. moving impetuses towards the feminist movement, moving them back into the 19th century. But overall, the shift is right, because they start with, this is how they mourned in Rimpar in Bavaria for 7 days in Act 1. And then they move it to 3 days in Act 2. And by the end, they just have 3 minutes of silence for when it's Philip who dies. And so there's this sense that Judaism did change in America, and some Jews got assimilated and left traditions behind, but some Jews did not, and they maintained the traditions. But that's not what we see in the play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kat, I wanted to go back to this concept of the American dream, and kind of how you were bringing that thought and question and critique and discussion into the production. And let's see, I've got a question here. In Backstory, you write, in regard to the myths about the American dream, creation myths aren't powerful because they're true. They're powerful because they provide a foundation, however flawed, for constructing a collective identity. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if you can explain that, and maybe talk a little bit more about, as an immigrant yourself, how you approach and think about the American dream and how it connected to this play.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I wrote that statement, it was, in the essay, I was trying a little bit to define what the American dream is, an impossible task, because the definition of the American dream has not only evolved over history, it also means different things to different people. So, and part of, I think the idea of this American dream, which broadly, I think, in 2023, we can agree is an extension. It's trying to, it's the idea that you can achieve anything that you want to, and that America gives you the freedom to define yourself in that way. The fact, that I think this idea of like this idea that America gives you that is often refuted by history, the idea that it had actually be attained. There are many counterexamples to this, to the hope of the American dream. But that is the power, I think, of the American dream, that there is a hope to it. And the Lehman trilogy is a very specific manifestation of one immigrant's family's experience, fictionalized, but their experience nonetheless, of what it is to come to America and strive in pursuit of the American dream. What is interesting to me about this is that their experience is not typical. There are many other families who also moved to America over many, many years, who did not achieve the staggering wealth and success that the Lehman brothers did. And we can argue that, yeah, maybe the founding three brothers could not really have envisioned this specific success when they first came here. Nonetheless, it is definitely success by many, many standards, financial influence, etc. It's not typical, but the point being that the American dream sustains because of the hope that it creates, right? Every day you think, I may not have achieved it yet, but maybe I will. And there is this, and the power of these kinds of creation myths within the US, the things that drive the US, like the idea that it is a free and egalitarian society, never mind the fact that it was founded on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black people. That foundational identity of America as a free place, an equal place where you can achieve that hope, it is central, I think, to not only the identity of the US, but the appeal of the US globally, the erasure of historical truth in this creation myth. The power of that in the American identity would not sustain otherwise.
Thank you for sharing that. Pamela, real quickly, there was a question coming off our last. Were the prayers that they were reciting in Hebrew or Yiddish?
They were in Hebrew, and I actually, in Backstory, mentioned this, but there's a problem. And the problem is that they were reciting it in the dialect that Jews who pray today in the United States or in the state of Israel, they use that particular dialect, but the Lehman brothers would have used the dialect that they spoke in Germany in the 19th century. And that's a different dialect. And Nick and Vanessa and I had a conversation early on about what to do. And my sense was that Massini either didn't know the other dialect, or he wanted anybody who actually might have known some Hebrew. He wanted them to be able to understand the prayers. And I should tell you that one of the prayers, the memorial prayer for the dead, which is the last prayer that they say at the end of Act 3, but they also say it earlier in Act 1. The language of that is actually Aramaic and not Hebrew. So a language, a Near Eastern language that's very close to Hebrew, and people who know Hebrew can understand it, but it's actually in Aramaic, which was a spoken language in that world.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a question that's come up here and also has come up in other conversations and in the press a couple of times, which is this idea of the play being critical of the play for perpetuating a stereotype of Jews being involved or motivated by greed, or the play being anti-Semitic. And I wonder if either of you have a response to that comment, or that response that people sometimes have to the script.
Right. I mean, I do not see the play as anti-Semitic. I think actually in some ways calling it anti-Semitic is actually a problem, because then what you're doing is you're reading into something that's not there. So what the reason it gets called anti-Semitic is because it is about the Lehman brothers and about money. And the Jews have been associated with money as a negative, in a negative way, really since the New Testament, and certainly gets amplified in the Middle Ages, and then especially with Shylock, who becomes a code word for nefarious Jewish greed, all the way down into the 20th century, and maybe even still into the 21st century. But the Lehmans are one immigrant family who make it in America. It's not a play that is saying all the Jews are greedy and all the Jews are out to do is to make money. And the Lehmans, as Kat said, not so many immigrants never achieved their success, but lots of immigrants who did, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, are, nobody would say that because they achieved success that we would be going after them. So I understand what people said. You're showing about a Jewish family who made a lot of money and who are greedy, but that doesn't make the play anti-Semitic.
Thank you. So many questions. Thank you all for offering so many great questions. Mary asked, Kat, did you communicate with Stefano Massini regarding the work at all over the course of the...
It's a funny anecdote to this one. So no, I did not. Our director, Nick Bowling, attempted to communicate with Stefano, sent Stefano a message on Facebook. I don't recall the exact wording of the message that Stefano replied with, but basically Stefano said, thank you so much for being interested in my work. This is entirely in your hands as a playwright. I want to, I am deeply paraphrasing. That's not exactly what he said, but he basically, the gist of it was that he believed that his work was done as the playwright because it is an existing play that already had a production. The words were already fixed. We got the rights to perform the words that were written, and he wanted us to take an interpretation as we saw fit. So Stefano's response to Nick was a very polite, thank you, but no.
Very polite.
Yeah. But it was really funny in the room as we talked about it, because he I don't know if he was quite as polite as you're making him out to be.
No, well, it's a translation issue, maybe, because English is not his first language. But I wish I remember. Well, Nick has the message. I don't, but it was funny.
Yeah.
There's a question as well about the actor dialect. Sometimes they spoke with light accents. Sometimes they did not. Do we know if that was a directorial choice or an author's choice? Either way, how do you think it enlightens the text and the audience experience? And I just want to call out Kathy. This is Mark who asked that question. And Kathy, who says, I thought the accents demonstrated an evolution of the characters and their stages of life very well. So just one audience response to that. So
it was 100% a directorial choice. So just for a little insight into the script, If you picked up a copy of the book, you will see, as Pamela pointed out, that it is written entirely in blank verse. And it kind of reads like an audiobook. It's just like this happened and this happened in third person. The script itself is like exactly the same. There are minimal stage directions. We have like little scene splits, but they don't really say how it ends, how it begins. There's not a ton of instruction about how to do the play. And part of, I think, the theatrical ask of this play is that you're given this third person narration that's very audiobook-like, but you have to make it interesting and you have to make something happen on stage so that the audience doesn't just feel like they're watching an audiobook happen. And so there was no instructions given about how dialect should or should not function in the script. So it was entirely directorial choice. And Nick and Vanessa chose to have the three actors play a kind of neutral default that was a kind of mix between themselves and the base character of the original three Lehmans that they were cast as. And whenever they went into their specific characters, the accents would manifest depending on who they were playing. So different characters would have different rhythm and intonation and different levels of how strong or not strong the dialect was. I want to offer the audience the chance, if you've already seen the play, to make your own interpretation about how this particular directorial choice landed for you. But I will just say that it's completely directorial choice. I have since seen the National Theatre recording of Lehman Trilogy, the one that went on Broadway. That production made a slightly different choice with the three actors playing the three Lehman brothers as their base characters. But it's different from the choice that Nick and Vanessa made, and it has a different effect. And I would invite everyone to be able to bring their own interpretation to what the effect of this ensemble of actors who are kind of themselves kind of characters snapping in and out is doing for you.
I would just add my admiration for the actors for their ability to do that, because I thought that was so difficult. And for me, it really enhanced the play, because you knew when they were essentially narration talking to the audience, and then when they were in character and in their voice.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I agree with that. I think that for me, it adds quite a bit and helps delineate all those different characters and carries you through, and kind of allows, someone commented here, I don't know if this is related to the accents, but liking the style of the family's conversations through the year. And I feel like those style, you start seeing the different personalities of the family members as we go through time through some of that work. There's a question here about if any of the members of the Lehman family, speaking of through the generations, are any members alive today? And if so, have any of them seen the play, and what did they think? As far as I know, they've seen our play, but I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah. So a friend of mine who's Jewish historian at Columbia, was involved with the Park Avenue Armory production. She said that she worked on the playbill there, and there was somebody there that she knew who was a member of the Lehman family, and who said, this is a really interesting play, but it's not about my family. So that was her reaction. So I'm sure there are others as well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, so something that happens around Act 3 of the play is that, but also historically, is that after Bobby Lehman was the last Lehman to head the firm. So up until that point, the Lehman Brothers was a purely family-owned business. I mean, family-owned to the extent that someone with the last name of Lehman was always leading the firm or on the board. So Bobby Lehman was the last Lehman to hold this leadership position. And I think part of it, and this is a little bit of speculation, but part of it was simply that in the 1800s, when they first started the firm, it was a little more conventionally, socially accepted that there's a family business, somebody is going to take over the family. And a more contemporary view of business is that, in line with American individualism developing over the years, if you don't want to do the job these days, you don't have to take the job. So the firm passed out of Lehman hands after Bobby. It still retained the name Lehman Brothers, but we have a family tree in the lobby if you plan to come see the show. You can also look up, the family tree online. The family got quite large over the years, so there are plenty of living Lehmans. I cannot speak to whether any of them have seen the show at this point. They are more divorced from what the Lehman Brothers as an entity was. You know, they have their own identities and lives. But I would agree with Pamela that, you know, with all the factual changes that have happened, I think that they would, if anything, the play is in pursuit of something that isn't just a historical replica of the Lehman lives.
Which sort of connects. There's one other question here about sort of the family, which I wanted to bring up, but were the brothers' personalities and talents as presented in the play historically accurate? Do we know if that's the case?
In a very broad sense, there were historical characteristics that were taken. You know, I think the idea of Maya Lehman being the person who's very good at talking, Emmanuel being more of a doer, the idea of Herbert Lehman being a very progressive politician. These things were fundamentally true. But there was definitely a fictionalization of how these characteristics actually manifested in real life. So a good example, the play portrays Bobby Lehman as being really interested in art as a child, that he maybe even wanted to be an artist as a child. That's not really in the historical record. What is in the historical record is that Bobby Lehman loved to collect fine art. He had like one of the best collections of fine art in the country, and he like passed it on to a museum at his death. So there is some, I'm going to say flanderization, but I don't know if that's a term known outside of pop culture. There was some flanderization or poetic license taken with the fundamental traits of who the brothers are. The other thing to also keep in mind is that, you know, especially in the 1800s, there's not a great historical record of, you know, people are not on social media all the time back then. There's not a great video record of how people would carry themselves and talked and all of that. Like, so there was definitely a lot of poetic license taken. The very, very bones of it is true, and beyond that, there's poetic license.
Right. The theme of our conversation tonight, poetic license. Okay, I've got so many good questions. I got a couple more here and then a couple more that I had prepared, but I'm going to keep going with the audience questions. Dan is asking us, can you talk about how and maybe why the third act of the play kind of glosses over and almost brushes past the post-family years of the firm leading up to its demise?
Pamela, do you want me to start?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. It's also my least favorite act. So you started.
Okay. Yeah. So in some of I looked up in some of the interviews that Stefano Massini did, and he was emphatic about a few things. He obviously was interested in this incident because of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the firm, and how it had a global impact. But when he started writing this play, he wasn't interested in just talking about like economics or the historical record. He was interested in the family of the Lehmans. So the play, if the third act kind of feels like it starts to slow down, it's because Bobby Lehman, who I think came out of power in about like 1960s or so, I could be slightly off on that, but it's around there. Bobby Lehman is the last Lehman to lead the family, after which it isn't really a family saga anymore. Like the firm is still existing, but it's not a family saga. So what happens after Bobby Lehman's death in the play is Stefano Massini metaphorically just hits the accelerator and zooms past the final 40 years or so of the play in like 10 pages. So this is happening just because that the question of Lehman Brothers as a firm beyond the family is just not a question that I think Stefano Massini was interested in. Yeah, and so, you know, and there's a lot written up about why the firm collapsed. It's just part of like the lobby display that, you know, I created with the timeline, and it, you know, and it's all available online. I think it's maybe one of the big things that drew you as the audience to come see this play. But Stefano Massini invited you in with that premise, and then I think was seeking to offer a different perspective on a global incident.
I would just add, so I mean, really what happens is the first two acts are less than a century, and the last one is, you know, he just collapses an entire century into the last act, and it does have that feeling of being rushed, and you do lose, like you said perfectly, you said we lose the family, and it's the family that we're really interested in the play. It's what draws us to these characters who actually have so many flaws that we should really not be drawn to them. We should not want to find out the story of their lives, right? Some of them are slaveholders. They're accumulating a great deal of money. They're taking advantage of people whose lives have been disrupted by fire. But we're drawn to them because it's a family story, and that's something we can all relate to.
Let's see. Pamela, so you have written a few books about the history of Jewish people in America. And how has the experience of working on this play and sort of examining this family and this story overlapped sort of what you've written about before?
Well, I have, one of the things that obviously I've written about is that migration of the Jews who come from Central Europe between roughly the 1820s to the 1880s, although it was especially focused on women. And one of the scenes is, I think it's why one of the scenes that I particularly love, that I know also that our audiences love, is when okay, so which one's getting married? It's Mayer's getting married, right? And he's using the months. Do I have the right
Philip.
one? Philip.
Oh.
It's yeah. He's dating. He's dating. He
Yeah.
decides. Yeah, he decides it's time to get married.
300 days. It's 200 days. It's 100 days.
Right,
That kind of thing.
right. Yeah, and he's using, I'm dating this one, I'm dating that one, I'm dating the next one, but they're all according to the Hebrew months. And what really jumped out at me is one of the things that I wrote about in my book is how these men ultimately end up getting married, because they come to America as young single men, and then they have to find a bride. Some of them did well enough that they actually sold their businesses, went home, brought back a bride, or they, if they were in Chicago or they were in Alabama, they might have gone to find a bride in a big city like New York, or maybe a Jewish community like in Philadelphia. So I was interested in that. So it intersects somewhat with what I've written about, but I had never written about the Lehman Brothers before. But I have to tell you, the manuscript I'm writing right now, I just stuck 2 sentences about them into the manuscript.
Oh, and because you said it was the months, you're correct. It was Maya, it's not Philip. They all play these little games of marriage and through the play.
Every marriage has its own fun to it in the play.
Right.
Well, I'm excited to hear about a legacy of this experience being in one of your books. That's very exciting. There's another question here from Shoshana, who says, as a business professor, I found it interesting that the play discusses a number of how to succeed in business, like looking for opportunities, adapting to new environments, and the emphasis on marketing. Comments from...
I think that's interesting. I think it depends on the personal experience of the audience member coming in to see the play. I had a friend come to see the play who has an economic background, and he actually didn't feel like the play discussed the economic situation or the financial situation very much at all, which is a very opposing viewpoint. And he felt like the play was more of a family saga of like through finance rather than being about finance per se. And that's just another opinion. Again, it's one perspective. It's not factual or objective in any way, but it's interesting to hear all of these different responses to the play and like the many themes that get covered over the 3 hours of it. And I think to this point as well, like the play definitely has to touch upon these financial and economic concepts, because that's what the Lehman Brothers ultimately started working in. But the extent to which it does and doesn't, I think, depends on the personal perspective and taste of the audience member viewing it. I mean, on my part, I think one of my favorite passages in the play is from the act that Pamela loves the least, Act 3. But I love the section that talks about marketing, what it does, and how we will teach people to not to think about what they need, but what they want, so that they will simply buy the things that they want rather than the things that they need. And I think that's a very powerful sentiment in contemporary America. That's how I think capitalism has shaped us to function. And it is about finance in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting that some of that Act 3 becomes the family isn't there anymore, but Senior takes the opportunity to kind of bring in some big concepts about business, like marketing, and and sort of evoke them. And Anish Jethmalani, who's the actor who gives that speech, says that he's very, very connected to that moment in the play and always slows down just a little bit because he really wants it to land. As he said,
maybe that's why I've been receiving
he
it.
said that in our
So it
discussion
works.
with the cast, and he talked about that being a really important moment for him in terms of, like you say, like something that's important to bring forth, and he wanted to
Oh
really
my God, tell him it's working. Every time
yeah,
I saw
yeah,
it done, I was like,
absolutely. Well, we are very close to our end here, and we don't have any other audience questions in the piece. I did want to bring in and recognize the third dramaturg on the team, who is Duran Williams, who couldn't be here tonight, but sends his regards. And Kat, maybe you and both of you could maybe speak a little bit about how you worked with Duran in this process, and what he brought to the conversation and to the investigation of the play.
yeah, so Duran was hired. So the reason that there's 3 people on the team is because the play is so big. So Pamela obviously was covering, the Judaica of the play. I was covering the immigrant narrative of the play, and Duran was hired because the play has a very critical textual omission, which is namely the way the Lehmans profited from the enslavement of Black people in order to kickstart their business. As you know, they started their business in Alabama, and they were cotton brokers. And in the mid 1800s, I think it should go without saying how cotton was produced in America at that time. So Duran was really looking after that portion of the piece. You can look at some of his work and backstory. He wrote a whole essay about this omission, and in the way that I worked with Duran. So in the production dramaturgy, as much as I said that this play isn't just about factual truth, Timeline produces a lot of content around the historical reality of the play. So Duran and I divvied up the work. So I would author specific parts of the content that you could read, and Duran wrote certain other parts. Duran also took point for producing the actor packet that the actors only got to see. This is not an audience-facing document, but Duran, had this great idea to create this website that would make the whole thing just more accessible and easy to update at once, rather than a printed document, or the way that I would have done it. But Duran's idea was better. I was just going to do a Google Drive folder, but I think we all get too many Google Drive folders. The website was so much sleeker. It was this one link that you could just drop anywhere, and it was easier to update and more user friendly. So yeah, and then on his part, he was also responsible for noting with the directors, having conversations with them, and like I said, he was really looking after the piece of how this play dealt with the racist history of America and how that racism built the finance world as we know it today.
And I just want to add that, remember that even though the African Americans, the enslaved, were emancipated in 1865, essentially they're tied back to the land to produce cotton during Reconstruction, but especially after Reconstruction. So the Lehmans are really implicit in this history for a very long period of time. And Duran was really helpful in making sure that we knew that.
Well, we're almost at time, just have a couple more minutes, and I guess I'd be interested in having each of you maybe offer any closing thoughts about your experience, or the parting advice to audience members as they think about this play and their experience, either having already seen it or going to see it, and if you have any wrapping up thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, one thing that I think is the most difficult thing about this play is that it is such a long play. It is really the length of 2 plays, and so it's tremendous admiration for everybody who was involved with it. But even despite the length, because of the power of the acting and the staging and the lighting and the music and the way it's all put together, it flies by. So that's my advice. So if you haven't seen it, definitely go see it.
Excellent.
It is, it's definitely a long one. It covers a great scope of material, both in like years and also like themes. I think my only thought is that, you know, there's a lot written about this play. It's a very well-known play. I think the Broadway production especially was very culturally impactful. I think if you're going to come see this production, if you've already seen it, like to come in with a bit of an open mind, to not have the answers to this production coming in, but to let it be what it is. And especially if you've also seen the Broadway production, to see it on its own terms, as its own entity, asking its own questions, trying in pursuit of its own answers, rather than the interpretation that anybody else has. Because I think Nick and Vanessa are in pursuit of something that's very unique within this production.
I agree.
Thank you both so much for your comments and your thoughtful, all the information, everything you shared with us tonight. It's been so great. Thank you to everyone who has been here in our audience listening in. And the show is continuing through November 26th. So the marketing director and me has to say that. And hope that you'll continue to spread the word and share with folks about your experience with the play in this discussion. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Pamela and Carol and Carol Ann. And have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.